twin sisters vanished in 1999. 26 years later, construction workers found something that should not exist. Carol Morrison adjusted her reading glasses as she sat in the sunroom of Meadowbrook Nursing Home, studying the newspaper article her daughter had brought during morning visiting hours. The headline read, "Historic Cedar Falls property to become shopping center." Below it, a photograph showed the White House with blue shutters, where she had raised her family for 18 years. At 73, Carol's hands trembled slightly as she held the paper. The article mentioned that demolition would begin the following week. Heartland Development Corporation had purchased the property from the Walsh family, who had lived there for over 2 decades. The new shopping center would feature a grocery store, pharmacy, and several smaller retail spaces. Carol folded the newspaper and placed it on the small table beside her chair. Through the window, she could see other residents walking along the garden paths, but her mind was elsewhere. She had not returned to Maple Street since 2003, when she and Jim had moved to Des Moines following his job transfer. They had sold the house to escape the memories that filled every room. The nursing home staff had become accustomed to Carol's quiet demeanor during the 6 years since Jim's heart attack. She participated in activities when encouraged, but preferred to spend time alone, often staring out windows or reading books from the facility's small library. Other residents and their families assumed she was simply adjusting to widowhood, unaware that her isolation had deeper roots, stretching back decades. 3 days later, Carol's daughter Linda arrived for her weekly visit carrying a manila envelope. She sat across from her mother in the same sunroom, her expression unusually serious. Linda worked as a paralegal for a Des Moines law firm and often brought interesting news stories or legal documents that might occupy her mother's attention during the long afternoons at the facility. The envelope contained photocopied police reports and newspaper clippings. Linda explained that a construction worker had discovered something unusual while excavating the foundation for the new shopping center. The Cedar Falls Police Department had contacted families who had previously lived at the address, seeking information about any items that might have been buried on the property over the years. Carol's breathing became shallow as she read the police report. A metal box had been found 8 feet underground, containing 2 silver lockets with photographs of teenage girls. The lockets appeared to have been buried for decades, but showed signs of recent disturbance. The burial site was located in what had been the backyard of her former home on Maple Street. Linda watched her mother's reaction carefully. Carol had never spoken in detail about the events that had changed their family's trajectory, but Linda understood that her twin sisters had vanished when she was only 8 years old. The trauma had shaped Carol's entire adult life, influencing her parenting style and contributing to the family's eventual departure from Cedar Falls. Carol stood abruptly and walked to the window, still holding the police report. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman aged beyond her years, carrying the weight of unanswered questions that had accumulated over more than 2 decades. She pressed her palm against the cool surface and closed her eyes, remembering a time when the backyard had been filled with laughter and the sound of children playing. The nursing home's afternoon routine continued around them. Residents gathered for recreational therapy sessions, visitors arrived with flowers and homemade treats, and staff members moved efficiently between rooms checking on their charges. But Carol remained motionless at the window, processing information that had the potential to reopen wounds she had spent years trying to heal. Linda approached her mother and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She suggested they contact the Cedar Falls Police Department to arrange a meeting with the detective handling the case. Carol nodded without turning around, her gaze fixed on the parking lot where other families were saying goodbye after their visits, unaware that their own family's long nightmare might finally be approaching some kind of resolution. The drive to Cedar Falls took 90 minutes through Iowa farmland that had changed little since Carol's childhood. Linda had arranged for a nurse's aide to accompany them, concerned about her mother's emotional stability during what would certainly be a difficult day. Carol sat in the passenger seat, clutching a small photo album she had brought from her room at the nursing home. They arrived at the Cedar Falls Police Department on a gray Tuesday morning in March. Detective Sarah Parker met them in the lobby, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that suggested extensive experience with sensitive cases involving families and loss. She led them to a conference room where evidence boxes and manila folders were arranged on a long table. Detective Parker explained that the lockets had been sent to the state crime laboratory for analysis. Preliminary examination confirmed they were genuine silver manufactured in the late 1990s. The photographs inside showed two identical teenage girls with shoulder-length brown hair and matching smiles. The plastic wrapping that had protected the lockets suggested deliberate preservation rather than accidental burial or natural decomposition. Carol opened her photo album and pointed to a picture taken in the spring of 1999. Rebecca and Rachel Morrison stood in front of their house, wearing matching navy blue polo shirts and khaki pants. They were 16 years old, honor students at Cedar Falls High School, and had been planning to attend a classmate's birthday party the weekend they disappeared from their lives forever. The resemblance between the girls in the buried lockets and the twins in Carol's photograph was unmistakable. Detective Parker made notes as Carol confirmed that the lockets had been birthday gifts, purchased at Johnson's Jewelry in downtown Cedar Falls. The twins had received them on March 12, 1999, exactly 3 days before they vanished without a trace while walking home from their part-time jobs. Carol's voice remained steady as she recounted the events of March 15, 1999. The twins had worked their usual shift at Cornerstone Books, leaving at 5:30 p.m. for the familiar walk home through residential neighborhoods they had traveled hundreds of times. They were expected by 6:15 p.m. for the family's traditional Friday evening dinner, but never arrived. The family had called police by 8:45 p.m., beginning a search effort that would consume the community for months and leave permanent scars on everyone involved. Carol described the chaos of that first night, when neighbors had joined the search with flashlights and the local fire department had organized systematic coverage of the area between the bookstore and the Morrison home. Detective Parker reviewed the original case files, noting that the investigation had been thorough for its time. Search dogs had tracked the twins' scent to a location 3 blocks from their home, where the trail had ended abruptly on Cedar Avenue between Oak Street and Pine Street. Extensive ground searches had covered miles of surrounding territory without discovering any physical evidence. The FBI had joined the investigation during the second week, bringing federal resources and expertise in missing persons cases. They had interviewed family members, classmates, teachers, and community members. Phone records, computer usage, and personal belongings had been analyzed with the limited technology available in 1999. No evidence suggested the twins had planned to disappear voluntarily or had been involved in any dangerous activities. Carol explained that the twins had been inseparable since birth, sharing friends, interests, and even a part-time job at the local bookstore, where they worked weekend shifts to save money for college. Rebecca had maintained a 3.7 GPA and planned to study veterinary medicine at Iowa State University. Rachel had excelled in literature and considered teaching or journalism as potential career paths. Neither girl had ever received disciplinary action at school or shown signs of rebellious behavior. Their teachers described them as mature, responsible students who helped younger classmates and participated in community service projects. They had no history of staying out past curfew, experimenting with drugs or alcohol, or associating with individuals who might pose a danger to their safety. The original investigation had gradually scaled down as leads were exhausted and reported sightings across the Midwest proved false. By 2001, active searching had stopped, though the case remained officially open. Detective Garrison, who had led the initial investigation, had retired in 2003 without solving the case that had defined his final years of service and haunted his dreams. Carol and Jim Morrison had struggled with the uncertainty and gradual loss of community support as media attention faded and volunteer searchers returned to their normal lives. They had attended grief counseling sessions organized by their church, organized their own search parties on weekends, and maintained hope for several years that their daughters would be found alive. But the psychological toll had been devastating. Jim had developed high blood pressure and insomnia that required medication. Carol had experienced panic attacks whenever she saw teenage girls who resembled her daughters. They had participated in support groups for families of missing persons, but the lack of resolution had made healing impossible. Jim had accepted a job transfer to Des Moines in 2003, and they had sold their house to start fresh in a place without constant reminders of their loss. The White House with blue shutters had been purchased by David and Jennifer Walsh, a young couple with 2 small children who understood the property's history but believed they could create new memories there. Detective Parker asked about the metal box's burial location in relation to the original search efforts. Carol confirmed that police had searched the backyard extensively in 1999 using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains. The burial site had been examined multiple times without results. The discovery of the lockets suggested either investigative oversight or subsequent burial by someone with detailed knowledge of the property. The meeting concluded with arrangements for additional forensic analysis. The lockets would be processed for fingerprints and DNA evidence using modern techniques unavailable during the original investigation. The burial site would be re-examined using current archaeological methods and more sophisticated equipment. Detective Parker assured Carol that every available resource would be dedicated to understanding how the lockets had ended up buried in her former backyard. Carol and Linda returned to the nursing home as evening approached. The aide who had accompanied them noted that Carol had remained composed throughout the meeting, showing no signs of emotional distress, despite the potentially traumatic nature of the information being discussed. Carol had asked few questions and had spoken only when directly addressed, maintaining the same reserved demeanor she displayed in all social situations. The following week brought additional developments that transformed the investigation from a cold case review into an active crime scene. Soil analysis of the burial site revealed that the earth had been disturbed within the past 5 years, confirming that the lockets had been moved and reburied long after the original investigation had concluded. This finding suggested that someone with knowledge of the twins' disappearance had deliberately preserved the jewelry and placed it where it would eventually be discovered. Detective Parker called Carol with updates as the investigation progressed. Ground-penetrating radar had detected additional anomalies in the former Morrison property. A second excavation site, located 15 feet from where the lockets were found, showed evidence of a larger disturbance with dimensions and depth that suggested human intervention rather than natural causes. The pattern was roughly rectangular, approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, extending to a depth between 6 and 8 feet underground. The geometric precision and deliberate dimensions were consistent with a manually excavated burial site rather than natural ground disturbance or infrastructure installation. The discovery prompted immediate coordination with the county coroner and state forensic experts. Carol listened to these reports from her room at the nursing home, occasionally taking notes but rarely asking questions. Linda visited more frequently during this period, concerned about her mother's emotional state as the investigation intensified and moved toward what appeared to be a significant discovery. but Carol appeared to be handling the stress better than expected, perhaps because the developments offered the first potential answers to questions that had haunted her for decades. The second excavation began on a Thursday morning in late March, with work proceeding slowly under the supervision of forensic anthropologists from the state university. The team used hand tools and fine brushes rather than heavy machinery, sifting every shovelful of soil through mesh screens to ensure that no evidence was overlooked or damaged during the careful excavation process. At a depth of 6 feet, the excavation team found fabric fragments. Blue denim material, deteriorated by decades underground, but still recognizable as clothing that had once been worn by living people. Careful brushing revealed additional fabric pieces, cotton that had once been white or light-colored, now stained brown by soil minerals and decomposition processes that had worked slowly but inexorably over 26 years. Additional artifacts emerged as the excavation continued under increasingly intense media scrutiny. Belt buckles, shoe eyelets, and the metal frames from eyeglasses had survived the underground environment better than organic materials. Personal items included the deteriorated remains of backpacks and their contents. Textbooks had disintegrated beyond recognition, but metal spiral bindings from notebooks remained intact. Detective Parker called Carol with the preliminary findings. The artifacts were consistent with teenage clothing and accessories from the late 1990s. The positioning and quantity of remains suggested 2 individuals had been buried together in the same grave. Dental records would be required for definitive identification, but the circumstantial evidence strongly indicated that Rebecca and Rachel Morrison had been found after 26 years. Carol's reaction to this news surprised the nursing home staff. Rather than displaying grief or relief, she became more animated than anyone had seen her in years. She requested copies of all police reports and forensic findings. She asked Linda to bring additional photo albums and documents from storage. For the first time since Jim's death, Carol showed genuine interest in activities beyond her daily routine of meals, medication, and solitary reading. The dental records confirmed what investigators had suspected. The remains belonged to Rebecca and Rachel Morrison, who had been found 26 years after their disappearance in a grave that had somehow been overlooked during multiple professional searches of the property. The medical examiner determined that both twins had died from blunt force trauma to the head, injuries that would have caused rapid unconsciousness and death. The discovery of the twins' bodies prompted a comprehensive review of the original investigation. Detective Parker and her team re-interviewed surviving witnesses, re-examined physical evidence that had been stored in the department's evidence room, and applied modern forensic techniques to materials that had been collected but not fully analyzed in 1999 due to technological limitations. They also began investigating individuals who had access to the Morrison property and knowledge of the family's routines during the period when the twins disappeared. This review focused on contractors, utility workers, delivery personnel, and anyone else who might have had legitimate reasons to be on the property or in the neighborhood during March 1999. One name emerged repeatedly in the files: Robert Sandler, Jim Morrison's brother-in-law, who had performed extensive renovation work on the Morrison house during the summer of 1998. Sandler had been a local contractor with access to excavation equipment and detailed knowledge of the property layout. He had maintained a spare key to the house and had been familiar with the twins' schedules and activities. The original investigation files contained several references to Sandler, though he had not been considered a serious suspect at the time. He was family, known to the community, and had no history of criminal behavior or inappropriate conduct with children. The investigators in 1999 had focused their attention on strangers, transients, and individuals with prior convictions for violent crimes. The timeline placed Sandler in Cedar Falls during the weekend when the twins disappeared. His work schedule showed he had called in sick on Saturday, March 16, 1999, the day after the twins vanished. A neighbor had reported seeing Sandler's distinctive pickup truck in the Morrison neighborhood on Friday evening, several hours after the twins had disappeared, and around the time Jim Morrison was calling police. When originally questioned in 1999, Sandler had denied being in the Morrison neighborhood that evening. Confronted with witness testimony, he had changed his story, claiming he had driven through the area to check on a previous job site. His explanation had seemed plausible, but contained logical inconsistencies that investigators had noted, but not pursued aggressively. The previous job site Sandler claimed to be checking was located in a different neighborhood entirely, making his route through Maple Street both unnecessary and inefficient. When pressed for specific details about why he had chosen that particular path, Sandler had become defensive and had terminated the interview, requesting to speak with an attorney. Further review revealed concerning details about Sandler's behavior following the twins' disappearance. Coworkers had reported increasing unreliability and alcohol problems that had affected his job performance and professional relationships. His wife had described him as paranoid and obsessed with news coverage of the case, recording television reports and collecting newspaper articles about the search efforts. Sandler had made a substantial anonymous donation of $500 to the reward fund in April 1999, a significant contribution given his modest income and mounting financial problems. His wife had questioned the donation at the time, but Sandler had insisted they needed to help find the girls and had refused to discuss his motivations. In late 1999, approximately 8 months after the twins disappeared, Sandler had sold his excavation equipment and scaled back his construction business to focus on smaller residential projects that required only basic hand tools. He had claimed the decision was motivated by chronic back problems and a desire to reduce the physical demands of his work. But the timing coincided precisely with the period when police were actively investigating contractors who possessed equipment capable of digging burial sites. Sandler had also purchased a storage unit in Waterloo, Iowa, approximately 25 miles from Cedar Falls. The unit was rented under his company name and maintained until his death in 2001. The storage unit had been emptied immediately after Sandler's funeral, and its contents were unknown. Any potential evidence linking him to the Morrison case had been permanently lost when his widow had disposed of his tools, work vehicles, and personal belongings through charity donations and auction sales. Robert Sandler had died in a construction accident on September 14, 2001, 2.5 years after the twins disappeared. Scaffolding had collapsed at a commercial job site in Waterloo, killing him instantly. The incident had been witnessed by multiple workers and thoroughly investigated by OSHA. The final report had attributed the collapse to faulty assembly procedures, finding no evidence of intentional action or foul play. Detective Parker interviewed Sandler's widow, Patricia, who had remarried and moved to Arizona years earlier. Patricia described her late husband as increasingly troubled following the twins' disappearance. She confirmed his obsessive interest in the case and his declining mental health during 1999 and 2000. She also verified that he had possessed the means and opportunity to commit the crimes, but could provide no direct evidence of his involvement. Patricia Sandler recalled that her husband had seemed particularly disturbed by the extensive media coverage of the missing persons case. He had followed every development obsessively, maintaining a collection of newspaper clippings, and recorded television reports that he reviewed repeatedly during evening hours when his drinking was heaviest. She had attributed his preoccupation to normal community concern and sympathy for the Morrison family. Sandler's adult children from his first marriage provided additional insights into their father's psychological state during the period following the twins' disappearance. They remembered him becoming increasingly paranoid and socially isolated, checking door locks repeatedly and expressing fears about unknown threats that he could not or would not explain clearly. The investigation concluded with Robert Sandler identified as the primary suspect based on circumstantial evidence, opportunity, and behavioral changes following the twins' disappearance. Detective Parker prepared a comprehensive report documenting the case findings and submitted it to the district attorney for review. No formal charges could be filed due to Sandler's death, but the case was officially closed with a determination of probable cause. Carol Morrison attended the twins' funeral on a rainy Thursday morning in April 2025. The service was held at the same Methodist church where Rebecca and Rachel had been confirmed as children and where the family had attended services for 18 years. The caskets were closed, containing remains that had been released after forensic examination and preparation by the county coroner. The small gathering included family members, childhood friends of the twins who had maintained contact over the years, and several investigators who had worked on the case during different periods. Detective Parker delivered a brief statement summarizing the investigation's findings and thanking the community for its support during the renewed investigation. She announced that the case was being closed with the identification of Robert Sandler as the perpetrator, though she acknowledged that many questions would remain unanswered due to the passage of time and the death of the primary suspect. The announcement brought a sense of closure to some, but others wondered what additional evidence might have been discovered if Sandler had lived to face questioning. Carol listened to the service with the same composed demeanor she had maintained throughout the investigation. She had chosen simple granite headstones bearing only the twins' names and dates. Rebecca Morrison, 1,982 to 1,999 inches, and Rachel Morrison, 1,982 to 1,999 inches. Jim Morrison's grave was located nearby, and Carol had arranged for his headstone to be updated with an inscription acknowledging his daughter's return. In the weeks following the funeral, Carol began displaying items from the twins' childhood in her room at the nursing home. Photographs, school awards, and artwork were arranged on shelves and walls that had been bare for years. She started attending group activities and engaging in conversations with other residents. The nursing staff noted a significant improvement in her mood and social interaction. Linda visited her mother more frequently during this period, bringing additional mementos and helping to organize the twins' belongings that had been stored in boxes for decades. They spent hours looking through photo albums and sharing memories that had been too painful to discuss for years. Carol began speaking about Rebecca and Rachel in present tense, as if their discovery had somehow restored them to the family. The investigation's conclusion brought a sense of closure that Carol had never expected to experience. The twins' bodies were buried in Cedar Falls Memorial Cemetery under a large oak tree that provided shade during summer months. Carol arranged for a bench to be installed nearby, where visitors could sit and remember the girls who had been found after 26 years. Robert Sandler's construction background provided clear explanations for how the crimes had been committed, but it could not account for who had moved the lockets years later. The forensic timeline was precise. The jewelry had been buried in 1999, then carefully excavated and reburied sometime between 2020 and 2024. The person responsible had worked with archaeological precision, using small tools to avoid damaging the delicate silver. Detective Parker obtained property records for the Walsh family's 22 years of residence. The couple had hired contractors for routine maintenance projects over the years: roof repairs, plumbing updates, landscaping installations. Each contractor was interviewed and asked to provide employment records for the period when the lockets had been moved. Most workers could account for their activities through invoices, photographs, and witness statements. But one name appeared in the Walsh family's records that had no corresponding business documentation. Marcus Sullivan had performed yard work for the family during 2022 and 2023, accepting payment in cash and leaving no paper trail of his services. Jennifer Walsh remembered Marcus as a quiet man in his early 40s who had approached them about lawn maintenance after their regular landscaping company had raised prices. He had worked alone, arriving early in the morning and completing tasks efficiently before the family began their daily routines. He had never entered the house or asked for access to utilities, bringing his own water and equipment. The Walsh family had no contact information for Marcus, beyond a cell phone number that was no longer in service. They described him as approximately 6 feet tall, with graying brown hair and weathered hands that suggested extensive outdoor work experience. He had driven an older pickup truck with tools and equipment in the bed, but they could not recall the license plate or specific make and model. Detective Parker ran the name Marcus Sullivan through state and federal databases, finding dozens of matches across the Midwest. None of the individuals had criminal records or connections to Cedar Falls or the Morrison family. The investigation team began the tedious process of tracking down each Marcus Sullivan to determine if any had worked in the area during the relevant time period. The search proved more complex than anticipated. Several Marcus Sullivans had died in recent years, making verification impossible. Others had moved to different states or changed their names through marriage or legal proceedings. The team expanded their search to include variations of the name and similar spellings, but the trail remained frustratingly cold. Carol Morrison provided additional details about her family's social connections during the late 1990s. She reviewed old Christmas card lists, school directories, and church membership rolls, searching for anyone named Marcus who might have had knowledge of the Morrison property or the twins' disappearance. The exercise proved emotionally exhausting, but yielded no useful leads. Linda helped her mother compile a comprehensive list of individuals who had visited the Morrison house during the years leading up to the twins' disappearance. The list included relatives, friends, classmates, teachers, delivery personnel, and service providers. Marcus Sullivan did not appear on any of these records, suggesting he had no direct connection to the family during that period. Detective Parker considered the possibility that Marcus Sullivan was not the person's real name. Someone seeking to access the Walsh property for the purpose of moving the lockets might have provided false identification to avoid detection. This theory complicated the investigation significantly, as it suggested a level of premeditation and planning that indicated deep personal investment in the case. The detective team expanded their investigation to include individuals who had shown unusual interest in the Morrison case over the years. They reviewed letters and emails sent to the police department, tips called into hotlines, and attendance records from memorial services and community meetings related to the twins' disappearance. One pattern emerged from this review. Several individuals had contacted law enforcement multiple times over the years with theories, suggestions, and reported sightings that had proven false. Most of these people were well-meaning community members or amateur investigators drawn to unsolved cases. But one caller had demonstrated knowledge of details that had not been released to the public. The calls had been made from different phone numbers over a period of 15 years, always by a man who identified himself only as Mark. He had provided accurate information about the twins' clothing, their work schedules, and the timeline of their disappearance. But he had also made claims about seeing the girls in various locations that had been investigated and disproven. Detective Parker obtained recordings of these calls from the department's archives. The voice was calm and articulate, suggesting someone educated and familiar with police procedures. The caller had never been aggressive or threatening, but had displayed an emotional investment in the case that seemed disproportionate for someone without personal connections to the family. The most recent call from Mark had been received in early 2024, approximately 1 year before the lockets were discovered. He had suggested that investigators focus their attention on construction workers and contractors who had access to excavation equipment. At the time, the suggestion had seemed irrelevant to a cold case with no active leads. Detective Parker played the recordings for Carol Morrison, who listened intently but could not identify the voice. The caller's accent suggested someone from the Midwest, but not necessarily from Iowa. His vocabulary and speaking patterns indicated professional education, possibly in law enforcement, journalism, or a related field that required clear communication. The investigation team traced the phone numbers used by Mark over the years. Most were disposable cell phones, purchased with cash, and discarded after a few months of use. The pattern suggested someone who understood surveillance techniques and was deliberately avoiding identification. This level of operational security seemed excessive for a typical concerned citizen. Linda Morrison spent hours at the nursing home with her mother, reviewing the case files and searching for connections they might have missed. Carol's memory remained sharp for events from the 1990s, but she struggled to recall details from more recent years. The possibility that someone had been watching their family for decades was deeply disturbing. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Margaret Bradley, the former owner of Cornerstone Books, contacted Detective Parker with information she had remembered after reading newspaper coverage of the twins' discovery. She had kept a customer mailing list from the bookstore that included individuals who had special-ordered books over the years. The list contained an entry for M. Sullivan, who had ordered several true crime books and police procedural guides during 2000 and 2001. The orders had been paid for, in cash, and picked up in person. Margaret Bradley remembered the customer as a polite man who had asked detailed questions about unsolved cases in the area, claiming to be writing a book about crime in small towns. Detective Parker obtained copies of the book titles that M. Sullivan had ordered. They included forensic textbooks, guides to criminal investigation, and several books specifically about missing persons cases. The pattern suggested someone with professional interest in law enforcement techniques, or someone studying methods for avoiding detection. The bookstore's records included a post office box number that M. Sullivan had provided for special orders that required advance notice. Detective Parker traced the box to a facility in Waterloo, Iowa, the same city where Robert Sandler had rented his storage unit and where he had died in the construction accident. The post office box had been rented under the name Marcus Sullivan from 2000 to 2003, then closed when the rental fees were not renewed. The original application had been paid in cash and included minimal identification information. The address listed was for an apartment building that had been demolished in 2005, making verification impossible. Detective Parker interviewed current and former employees of the Waterloo Post Office, seeking anyone who might remember Marcus Sullivan. One retired clerk recalled a man who had picked up mail regularly during the early 2000s, but had rarely received packages or letters. The customer had been punctual and polite, but had avoided conversations with staff members. The investigation reached another dead end, but Detective Parker had developed a theory about Marcus Sullivan's identity. The timeline of his book purchases, his knowledge of the Morrison case, and his presence in Waterloo suggested a possible connection to Robert Sandler. She began investigating whether Sandler had had children or relatives who might have discovered evidence of his crimes. Robert Sandler's family history revealed no sons or male relatives named Marcus, but his widow, Patricia, mentioned during a follow-up interview that her husband had maintained friendships with several co-workers in the construction industry. Some of these men had continued to visit her for several years after Sandler's death, offering assistance with home repairs and expressing concern for her welfare. Patricia provided names and contact information for Sandler's former associates. Most were retired or had moved away from the area, but Detective Parker was able to interview several by phone. One name emerged that had not appeared in previous investigations. Mark Sullivan, a concrete specialist who had worked with Sandler on several projects during the late 1990s. Mark Sullivan had been Robert Sandler's closest friend in the construction industry. They had shared tools, collaborated on complex projects, and socialized outside of work hours. Patricia Sandler remembered Mark as a quiet man who had seemed genuinely grief-stricken by her husband's death and had offered to complete unfinished projects at no charge. Detective Parker located Mark Sullivan through employment records from a Des Moines construction company where he had worked until retiring in 2020. The man was now 68 years old and living in a retirement community in Ames, Iowa. When contacted by phone, he agreed to meet with investigators, but seemed nervous about the nature of their inquiry. The interview with Mark Sullivan took place at the retirement community's common room on a Tuesday afternoon in May 2025. Sullivan was a thin man with calloused hands and a careful way of speaking that suggested he was choosing his words deliberately. He confirmed his friendship with Robert Sandler and acknowledged that he had maintained contact with Sandler's widow after the accident. Sullivan admitted that he had found items in Sandler's storage unit when he had helped Patricia clean it out in 2001. Among the tools and equipment, he had discovered photographs of the Morrison twins, newspaper clippings about their disappearance, and handwritten notes that suggested Sandler's involvement in their deaths. The discovery had shocked and horrified him. Rather than contact police immediately, Sullivan had taken the materials and hidden them in his own home. He had been unsure whether the evidence was genuine or whether his friend had simply been obsessed with the case like many community members. The decision had haunted him for years, but he had been afraid of destroying Sandler's reputation based on circumstantial evidence. As years passed, Sullivan had researched the Morrison case extensively, reading everything he could find about missing persons investigations and forensic evidence. He had made anonymous calls to police, hoping to provide helpful information without revealing his knowledge of Sandler's potential involvement. The guilt of his silence had consumed his retirement years. When Sullivan learned that the Morrison property was being developed and the family's belongings would be disturbed, he had decided to take action. He had obtained employment with the Walsh family under the name Marcus Sullivan, using his middle name to avoid detection. His goal had been to ensure that the twins' bodies would be discovered so their families could have closure. Sullivan had used his construction experience to locate the burial site through careful observation of ground conditions and vegetation patterns. Working during early morning hours, he had excavated the lockets and reburied them in a location where construction equipment would be likely to find them. The metal box had been his addition, intended to protect the jewelry and draw attention to its significance. Detective Parker arrested Mark Sullivan on charges of tampering with evidence and failing to report a crime. He cooperated fully with the investigation, providing the materials he had taken from Sandler's storage unit and detailing his efforts to ensure the twins would be found. His actions had delayed justice for more than 2 decades, but had ultimately led to the resolution of the case. Carol Morrison learned about Mark Sullivan's confession during a phone call from Detective Parker. The revelation answered the final questions about who had moved the lockets and why they had waited so long to ensure discovery. Sullivan's misguided attempt to protect his friend's reputation had prolonged her family's suffering, but his eventual decision to act had brought the closure she had never expected to receive. The case was officially closed, with Robert Sandler identified as the perpetrator and Mark Sullivan charged as an accessory after the fact. Sullivan pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for his cooperation and was sentenced to 2 years of probation. He expressed deep remorse for his actions and requested permission to attend the twins' funeral, which Carol Morrison granted. But one question haunted Detective Parker as she completed her final report. Mark Sullivan had admitted to moving the lockets to ensure their discovery, but he had insisted that he had never disturbed the twins' burial site. The grave had been found through ground-penetrating radar, not because of any markers or disturbances that Sullivan had created. So who had left the small pile of wildflowers that construction workers had found beside the burial site? And why had they been placed there just days before the excavation began?